Jeff Smith is, it's really rare for people to actually change the paradigm of the thing that they're immersed in. Immersion sort of negates that change a lot of the time, I think. Jeff Smith has managed to be immersed in this world of comics as literature, making no mistake or bones about it. No pun intended there. Really, there's no pun intended. It just came out. It's a sea change in that world, as you know, that happened so many years ago with the publication of Bone, but also preceding that and certainly after it. He presides over a company that lives right here in Columbus, Ohio, Boneville, and has in that capacity garnered 10 Eisner Awards and 11 Harvey Awards, which is incredible. I'd like to introduce Jeff Smith.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. We're here to celebrate something very special, the 35th anniversary of the comics anthology Raw. This was put together by a couple who were both creative, very intellectual, and also liked comics. We'll talk about Raw. Am I holding this too close? Is that too loud or anything? Okay, I got the big. Raw appeared in a period in comics history when there was really a blight. Underground comics had kind of petered out. There were the direct market was trying to get up and running. There wasn't really much interest in art comics. Definitely, I would say there was almost no interest in it. And these two people met each other, had different skills, shared this love of comics, and in the creation of Raw, something blossomed. Something came together. This beautiful magazine, which I brought a copy that I bought off the shelves in 1986. It was a big, beautiful book. We'll talk all about what was in it, but it launched careers. It changed the conversation in comics completely. I think I'm going to just introduce these two people right now. The author of Mouse and winner of a Pulitzer Prize, Art Spiegelman, and Françoise Mouly, art director of The New Yorker. Hi, guys. Well, thank you both so much for being here. We are going to, this is a roast, by the way. I don't know if I explained that.
Oh, like a host?
Yes. So this image that's on the screen right now, Art, Art and I picked this out to show because this is the final event of our Columbus Citywide Comics Festival, CXC, Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. And this image, Art, will you explain?
Well, when I was reading one of the many articles that seem to be appearing about this, either in the Dispatch or whatever.
I think it was in Forbes, actually.
In Forbes. They talk about the crossroads between art and commerce. So it took me a while to back up and stop being too narcissistic to realize they meant it more generally than this particular image that lives with some importance for me, which was a lithograph made in stone where I just wanted to make the world's most expensive Sunday comic section. And it was the bastard children of art and commerce murder their parents and go off on a Sunday outing. So like there's art, my mom, and then there's commerce, the money bags, my dad. And that's basically the brew that maybe all art comes out of, because Michelangelo had a pope, and we had publishers as we came up.
Popes,
but it just seemed
publishers.
like to be, it just seemed to be basically an illustration of at least that notion that the...
Well, and it also illustrates an idea that I've heard you express, like comics, you'll spell it C-O-M-I-X, C-O''mix, co-mix. Like it's the co-mixing of art and commerce. And our idea with Cartoon Crossroads was to have the crossroads represent, Columbus's history in the jazz circuit or the vaudeville circuit. And certainly a lot of cartoons came out of Ohio. The list is rather amazing. But I also liked it that this Forbes reporter said that the crossroads represents the crossroads between commerce and art. That's pretty cool. All right. Let's see, where would I like to start? Why don't we start with arcade? Now, what do I have? All right, let me get an arcade there.
Should be right near the top.
Now, do I tap on this? Is that what I do?
You could.
I could?
Yep.
Yeah. All right. This is Art's computer, so if I mess up a little bit, I apologize. Arcade. This was a really important starting place for you and Bill Griffith, right?
Oh, yes. And it grew out of the underground comics that had been flourishing from 67 into the 70s a bit, but it was all caving in by 74, let's say. The paraphernalia and head shop kind of places that were our primary distinguished distributors were being put out of business. And so Bill and I had talked about doing a magazine together a number of times, even when we first moved out to San Francisco at about the same moment, in I think 72. And he had worked with me on Short Order Comics. I'd worked with him on Young Lust. And here it felt like important to build a life raft for what was left of an underground comic scene that was all San Francisco based pretty much. And the idea was to make something that didn't have so hardcore content that we just couldn't get on a newsstand anywhere. So our goal was to get on newsstands with something that felt a little bit more like a magazine than an underground comic. So it was more like a normal-sized magazine. It had contents pages and editorials and letters, and wasn't as free-form as the underground comics. But it was sort of, we were growing up and comics were growing up. The underground comics had done something really important, which was the first time you didn't have art and commerce meeting. There's no commerce in the underground. I mean, there were drug dealers, but it had nothing to do with making money off your comics. But you did have, as a result, a peer-to-peer relationship. You were making comics for other grown-ups, even though they were all stoned, long-haired, whatever, but like us. So
Are
it
you
was
referring to
peer-to-peer.
me, or?
Yes. So it was all peer-to-peer, let's say. And that opened up the possibility of, as we were going, okay, sex, drugs, and violence is good, but there are other subjects too. And it allowed arcade to move into another kind of territory that Bill and I were very game to explore.
And you were in San Francisco?
Yeah, for the first few issues. I moved back because I couldn't take the heat, so I got out of the kitchen.
Well, I just want to back up a little bit and think about what were the late night conversations you and Bill were having that kind of excited you about the possibilities of comics, or what was making you think maybe we should try this this way?
Well, it was an outgrowth of a certain approach to comics that involved it being relatively natural to talk about literature and painting at the same time we were talking about comics. And I think Bill Griffith and I had a lifeline with each other because, I hung out with the rip-off press crowd, but you had to discuss which beer you liked most or which kind of pot cocktail you liked the most, or cars. And I wasn't good at any of those three subjects. And so it was great to hang with them, but we didn't have that much to talk about. So a constellation of artists who were sort of game to stretch that became the core of the arcade group.
I think that's interesting that you were like, oh, it just seemed natural to talk about art and paintings and comics, because of course it is, but it wasn't thought of that way at all at the time.
Right.
Let's switch over to Françoise. Now I have to use my memory to see if I know where that was. So if I go this way, here we go. Oh, there we go. Françoise. So Françoise, you grew up in France, and at some point you made a decision to move to New York, and I don't know how much of your personal life you feel like opening yourself up to, but would it be wrong to say you fled France, or you were looking for something, or?
I actually was studying architecture at Beaux-Arts in Paris, and I wanted a break from my studies. It's a long course of studies, it's 7 or 8 years, and it's all in studios. And I didn't think I was moving anywhere, but I wanted to get away from Europe, because when you're in France, I had gone to Italy and even England and Spain and Germany and so on. Here, at least it was far away. And I thought that I would like...
So the main attraction to New York was just that it was far away.
It was far away, and I would be away from everything I knew and anybody I knew for a year. I had a round-trip ticket.
Could you speak English then?
I thought I could, because I had gotten good grades at school in English until I landed, and I was doing okay in England, but when I landed in New York, then it became obvious that I couldn't understand a word.
Well, they barely speak English in New York.
But I thought I would do little jobs here and there, and I did. Whatever was available. Is New York of the 70s. It was pretty run down, but I was selling cigarettes at Grand Central Station, and I was working for a Japanese architectural agency making models.
Well, when you landed, did you have someone to meet you and kind of help you get set up?
No.
Or?
I mean, that was part of the adventures. It was like finding my own way, and I thought I would get all those little jobs as a way of paying the rent. But the language was a big issue, and somebody I met suggested that I pick up an issue of the Sunday New York Times, and I did, and 2.5 months later I was still turning the pages trying to understand what this massive thing was. So on my own I thought what would be good as a print object? It would be comics. So I went to the newsstand expecting to find Actuel or Métal Hurlant.
Oh, wait, okay, so you're saying that you were looking through the New York Times trying to kind of help you kind of get the language
learn-
down.
to
Working on one Sunday's time for about 2 months.
Yeah.
It takes me that long. But now so now I'm following you. So now
Right.
you're saying, okay, well, the heck with the newspaper, I'm going to go look for comics.
Comics is a good way to get an introduction to the language and to the lingo, to the way it is used. Not what you learn in school, but the way people use colloquial and expressions and so on. And there was nothing on the newsstand, whereas in France there would have been all those other comics magazines that would have been of my generation. So I was really surprised, and I asked around, and by then I had met people in independent cinema. There was the Anthology Film Archives, there was a number of places, and I liked that mindset of the filmmakers. It was very visual, not much language. Most of them were silent films. And one of the people I asked around knew art and said, oh, here is this magazine, gave me a copy.
This is of Arcade.
Well, actually, what was Hell Planet publishing?
Short Order.
It was Short Order. Okay. And I discovered, I saw a couple of issues of Arcade. I liked the Kuchar Brothers' work. I liked Justin Green's work. And then I saw Short Order, and I saw Prisoner on Hell Planet.
Which is, that's a pretty powerful strip.
And I was so shocked by this that I had access to meeting arts through the casual network.
Wait, hold on a second, okay. So you're now kind of meeting people and getting, making friends and hanging is if I say intellectuals, does that sound kind of creepy or?
But everybody was, a carpenter and,
They were just people with, okay, they were just hip people with good taste, okay.
Well, it was New York of the 70s, the difference between then and now is the price of the rent. So you still have a lot of young people coming out of college that want to spend a few years in New York. Now the barrier is so high. I see for our kids' generation, you have to pay like $1,200 to share a room in Queens, 45 minutes away from the city. It's ridiculous. But in 1970, I paid $110 a month. And I was able, that was a quarter of what I earned doing odd jobs here and there. And
Can I just say that her jobs require her to write a novel just so she could have the back flap? Because it was cigarette girl, carpenter, plumber, electrician, which is why I married her, and as well as actress in a Richard Foreman play, as well as the architectural model making. Did I miss one?
Well, I was also an assistant to, my father was a plastic surgeon.
Right, so when she was in France, she was working.
Yeah.
So she was a plastic surgeon.
Yeah. so the
It's
job
very,
list
very
was
related.
amazing.
Plumbing is much harder actually than plastic surgery.
However, this is it me doing this? I must have. The skills that you are displaying here, I don't know if you're learning them on the go. You're definitely a go-getter. You can do many different kinds of skills. You adapt to it. This is something that's going to come into play in a little bit. So you said that a filmmaker friend who was...
But that was also part of New York of the 70s, and it still remained true, is that I could learn on the go because people were so open about talking to me.
Right.
And I tried to keep that when I went back to Paris. I thought like, hey, there must be that much interesting fields in Paris. But in Paris, the door was closed. Unless you were an expert, unless you already had your degree, who are you to ask questions? Whereas in New York, it was, I met Richard Foreman because he was putting on a play. And at the end, they say, anybody interested, come to our open house. And I would ask questions when I met Art, I couldn't speak English, but I'd ask questions. And people were incredibly welcoming and open to explaining what they were doing, talking about their
You're talking
fields.
about what their projects were and their...
Yeah, it wasn't at all I came from a culture where you have to pretend to be an expert on everything and you're always being made to feel inadequate to the task, to a very culturally inclusive culture where just simply because you were interested in New York, people just accepted you.
Also, the art world we were hanging out in, it's not what would be called the art world now. The art world now is a bunch of stockbrokers who learned that there's more money to be made in putting out some kind of, cutting a pig open and putting him in amber or whatever. And a lot of these people were self-taught outsiders themselves. They looked like insiders to me from underground comics, which was over the edge. But they weren't like the sophisticated party boy painter gang. It was college dropouts who had a desire to know, people from other cultures who didn't quite fit in anywhere else, but people who were reading and came out of a generation of abstract expressionism and whatever. That was like the specific subculture of what we were hanging with.
All right, so we're at the point now where is it Ken Jacobs, the filmmaker who was friends of both of you, and Ken's the one who showed you Arcade?
Yes.
And then introduced you to art. Well, let's go to, here we go, back to art.
When I first met Art casually, I didn't like him because...
And who could blame her?
Well, because he spoke so fast, I couldn't understand a word of what he was saying, and he seemed very passionate about something, but I had no idea what. And it's really when I read his work that I was, and I'd seen some of the other comics, but Prisoner on Hell Planet left me speechless, and all of a sudden, the fact that someone could be so, tackling a topic so personal in an open manner, be so candid about his feelings, I did this thing which I never did, which is I picked up the phone. Because speaking was hard, but certainly speaking on the phone was even harder. And then I started asking Art questions, listening to him. And 8 hours later, I was still on the phone, and I realized I gotta meet this guy.
I kind of like this
spend more time
guy.
with him.
I'm trying to find Prisoner on a
It's
Helpline.
probably near the bottom. It's
Yeah.
wherever the, yeah.
Oh, I think it is.
You're
Oh,
near it. You're getting warmer.
I'm getting close here.
This is almost as bad as showing the slides. You should have just.
Yeah.
Never mind, never mind, never mind.
Okay, well, anyway, here I have some page from it.
Yeah,
I'm not
and
very good at that.
There it is.
it since has been incorporated in mouse, but at the time it was printed on newsprint, again in the context of Short Order and the other
And it's
underground comics.
and
It really stood out from all
it's
the
the
other.
story of
It's a story about my mother's suicide. And when I did it, it was one of the first times I ever did anything since I'd started getting work published, where I wasn't sure if I wanted it published or not. I just needed to do it. And that was because my mother committed suicide in 1968, and I think this is 72 or something. And in the intervening 4 years, all I can say is I had amnesia. If somebody asked, I could say, my mother committed suicide, but I didn't think about or remember the events that surrounded it. And then almost by fluke, like just a casual argument with the woman I was living with in San Francisco, I realized, I'm not angry at her, I'm angry at my mother. And then everything came flying back in. And at that point, I just had to write it down, because I actually remembered something that had been cauterized and I was cut off from. And at that point, I wanted to see what it would look like as pages. And I really thought I wouldn't publish it while I was doing it, but as a result, it allowed me the intimacy I needed to just go for broke. And it was such a smart thing to do, it got Françoise interested in me.
Well, what was so different is that I had been, looking at independent film, not just Ken Jager, but the things like Tom Tom the Piper Song, but Stan Brakhage and a lot of the independent film. And those were intellectually very exciting, but they were hard. They were demanding. I fell asleep half the time, which you...
Everybody in the audience did. It was the nature of those films. But actually, it's worth slowing down for a second, because when you're talking about comics, and of course you talk about art and literature, the thing is that the people who defined themselves as a kind of artist, which our generation of cartoonists just couldn't, it wasn't the vocabulary for it. We didn't... Look, when you talk to one of these filmmaker people that we knew, or the theater people, and you talked about communication, they would bristle. Communication? No. People must commune with you. In other words, you get to be the shaman, and they get to let you read their entrails or something. And me, I came from a world that had a magazine called Communication Arts, which was about how to sell cigarettes to people. And that notion of communication, I don't think would be as difficult if we were hanging out with writers. Writers acknowledge that there's an agreement between them and the person picking up the paper, that there's a degree of communication going on that wasn't part of the abstract expressionist contract, for example.
I didn't realize that.
And it was very clear for me, because my roommate, after I got the loft, I had a roommate that was, she also had an interesting way to earn a living. She was a cook on a tugboat because she loved boats, and but what she really wanted to be was a painter, and she would drop off her slide to all the galleries in Soho, to O.K. Harris and Sonneband and Leo Castelli, all of the would-be artists would do. And I would ask her, I'd say, Stephanie, can you please tell me what you're doing? Because it wasn't that obvious from looking at her painting. And she said, sure, no problem. And then she would go on into a half-hour explanation about, I studied with so-and-so, and he did this. I studied with Ken Nolan, and he did geometric circles, and then the stripes, and then in reaction to this, and then that, and half an hour later, it's okay, I'm sorry I asked. But it didn't have any kind of visceral resonance for me. Neither did any of the things that was in the galleries around it, whereas Art's work and very many of the strips in the underground comics were so democratically available. And then art started showing me Winsor McKay and actually like reading me old Mad magazines and reading Harriman and patiently explaining like every single thing to me. And it was a world opening up of like amazingly challenging, interesting, intellectually stimulating content in plain sight, available.
Can I ask where you were getting these comics to show her? Because in '74, it would have been pretty hard to get Harriman, Crazy Cat.
From his
Harriman.
closet.
Of course.
What's that?
From his closet.
Oh, yes. But it was in my closet because I've become really interested in old comics when I was about 14, and began ferreting these out from whatever places existed, and had the good fortune of having a mentor who was the first and main collector of crumbling newsprint in the 60s. In fact, at the Billy Ireland, there's drawers that I passed that are from the Woody Gelman collection. And so this man nobody really knew, say, Little Nemo. They just didn't know it. Like now, it would actually be part of your cultural obligation. If you don't know it, you can sound and feel stupid, you know. So
if you're
at that time,
into comics,
yeah. Well, no, now it's even broader than that. And at the time, nobody knew it, but Woody Gelman had collected at least 2 complete runs of Little Nemo from whatever sources it took. He was an ex-Fleischer animator who then got a job working for Topps Bubblegum, which was my Medici during the 60s and beyond, where that earned me a living. But his giant basement in Long Island was an absolute treasure trove. So I had old Sunday pages through Woody. He also is the person that saved all of the Little Nemos you can find at the Billy Ireland, the original artwork. That was his doing. So Crazy Cat, again, I was finding there was a book that had come out in the 40s. I had that book. I'd found little bits and pieces here and there, so.
All right, well, I kind of wanted to get into breakdowns, but I'm not finding images for it.
Breakdowns is right near the top somewhere, below where you...
Is that it? Is this might be breakdowns.
Yeah.
That's breakdowns, you're up there. Yep.
Oh, yeah, yes, there it is. Okay. So at this point, you've moved back to New York.
I moved back to New York in, I think, 75.
Okay.
I think. And I was still working with Bill on Arcade, but long distance. And Bill just mentioned the other day that there was voluminous correspondence, all of which I've forgotten, as well as forgetting whether I came back in 75 or 76 to New York. And it was, while doing that, I was just trying to figure out what I was doing here. And the same man, Woody Gelman, thought he was going to make $1 billion because Elvis Presley died. And he figured if he could come out with the Elvis Presley poster book in 2-3 weeks, he'd sell gazillions of copies. So
Did he? Did he?
No, it didn't go as well as he thought because they had it printed in Asia, and it took about. By the time it came back, there were always already.
Everybody had them.
Yeah, it was over. Nobody cared about Elvis's death that much anymore. But while that gleam was in his eye, he was asking everybody he knew, like Maurice Sendak, what kind of book would you like to make? Art, what kind of book would you like to make? And he just wanted to publish all these things. He had started a little magazine called Nostalgia Illustrated, I think, or Nostalgia Press Illustrated. Never quite came out, but Crumb worked on issue 0 that hadn't come out. I worked on issue beta right after that never came out. But here he figured he really had it. And what I really wanted to do is make an anthology of the work I had been doing in Underground Comics and in Arcade and have it in one place because...
That doesn't seem right.
The curtain's coming down on us.
Yeah.
I think somebody thought you were talking too long.
Oh, okay, I'll shut up.
So now, so a couple of pieces that you did are crucial to moving forward here, and one was Prisoner on the Hell Planet, and the other one was an early version of Mouse. Now, did those start in Breakdowns, or they were definitely
Breakdowns was a gathering of the Underground Comics
that
and
you had
the
done.
Arcade things that I had done. And the problem is I work slow, I don't work long, so nobody could really locate what I was doing because it was in the midst of a lot of other stuff, including stuff by me that I'd never want to see reprinted, like a comic strip about a talking turd in a toilet bowl that was basically a rip-off of One Froggy Day, the animated cartoon, except it was a talking turd rather than a frog. And I was doing this nonsense stuff, and then this mouse happened because I was invited into a book called Funny Animals, and the only requirement was that it be anthropomorphic characters. And at the time, it seemed like a very big deal to me because Robert Crumb had done the cover and the lead story, and there were no requirements of what one might do, and this was what I ended up handing in, something about cats and mice.
Yes. Now, I read somewhere that your original idea for Cats and Mice was applied to a different, not necessarily Nazis and Jews, but something else. And I thought that was interesting.
This doesn't specifically refer to Nazis and Jews. It's the Katzen and the Mäusen, and in the longer book, my father is working in a shoe factory, basically, which is actual, but here it was a kitty litter factory, so there were little transpositions, but compared to the underground comics that surrounded it, it was relatively sober.
Right.
So there was that, and then when I was first invited into Funny Animals, I just figured I'd do like an EC horror story with a humanoid mouse that would get caught in a mousetrap that would break its neck at the end of the story. So that didn't pan out too well either. So this was, I thought, the breakthrough strip for me. It's what let me understand that I was able to do something from the more interesting edge of what was happening in underground comics, which had to do with Justin Green's Binky Brown having introduced autobiographical material. So this came from just thinking about my own past with my parents.
And when I first met Art, he was gathering the work with the idea of doing this hardcover album, which had no equivalent. I mean, not only was there no comics on the newsstand, there were no comics in bookstores. Right. There was no place to distribute such a thing. But for me, what was interesting is that I saw him do the paste-up mechanicals and the color separation and all of the works that goes into the production of a book, and it's very similar to the stuff I had learned to be an architect.
So now, is this similar. When you decided to buy your own printing press and drag it up the stairs to your flat?
Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, you know, what happened is that I saw him work really hard gathering all this, and the agony of getting it published, because Woody had a stroke, and then the book was off, and then somebody else bailed him out. I mean, it just went on for months, like the book was happening, not happening. And again, nobody wanted this book to happen except Art. And eventually we went on press with like borrowed money, and I was there, and the color signature got messed up. And then we were like going through the sheets, trying to sort out what was salvageable of a very small print run, out of sheets that with a make-ready had gone badly. And I just felt like, I'm going to get my own printing press, and I'm going to get this right.
But actually, it came from something even goofier. Like, when Françoise was thinking of going back to study architecture some more but didn't want to, we're having these existential conversations about what one does with one's life. And I said, well, what would you like to do? And she said, make books. So I said, oh, you mean be a writer? No. Oh, so you want to be a publisher? Yeah. And for her, being a publisher meant making the book, physically.
Making books.
Yeah.
And so now, describe this printing press. I mean, how big was it?
Well, I mean, so, you know,
like is it big as a couch, or?
Well, part of it had to do with the rise of instant printing in the 70s, where those small, compact version of offset printing presses were available in print shops that did quick and instant printing. Is that what this was?
This thing looks like a locomotive or something. Let me find a picture.
It was a multilith, and it didn't have a very large bed, so I couldn't do super large sheets on it, and it was only a one-color press. So when I did color work, I had to run it 4 times through the press.
So to get 4 color, you had to run the same.
Yeah, I would have wanted
times.
a 2-color press.
Well, who wouldn't? I mean,
yeah, really.
So now is this in your loft?
Well, it was because I went to. I wanted to learn. It's not that obvious, and I went to a print shop, and they wouldn't let me. You know, I had apprenticed to be a plumber, and they had let me, but they wouldn't let me in a print shop. So I went to a vocational school, in Bed-Stuy, and they were teaching vending machine repair as well as printing. I mean, it's a craft. And I did take the course, which gave you hand-on aspects. And then after that, they actually offered me a job in a print shop, which I almost took, but instead I wanted to have my own
So
press.
is this the same loft you still have?
Yeah, but we didn't have an elevator, so it was difficult to bring.
It almost killed somebody, literally, coming in. Yeah.
I made a deal with a building next door had an elevator, and I befriended the people that were
And
in
like
the building
lobbed it
next
across.
door.
It started to sound like a Popeye
And then
cartoon
so
here.
we put the press in their elevator, and then from their elevator, from their loft onto the roof of our building, and then down one flight of stairs.
And the jerk who was like bossing these other two people around.
is the guy I was buying the print from. The press from, yeah.
So he's coming down a flight of stairs. He's got two guys at the top of the stairs, and he starts yelling at them. He says, I got it. And then says, all right, move it that way, let it go. So they let it go, and it pushed him down the entire flight of stairs, slammed into the wall, broke the sheetrock, and if he had landed on a beam rather than on the sheetrock itself, that would have been...
Pushed him into the... So it is like it looked like
It
Tom
was a
and Jerry.
cartoon,
It was the shape of Tom and
Fortunately,
Jerry.
there was no
Totally was a
bloodshed,
Tom
and
and Jerry
the press
cartoon,
wasn't
yeah.
broken,
Yeah.
but it got it in there. But it meant everything she printed, we had to haul reams of paper up 4 flights of stairs. It was
But I kept the press on a dolly, so I
You could
was
move
able
it out of the way
yes,
if you wanted
I
to
could
set
move
the
it.
table or something. All right, that's good.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm actually super impressed and love this part of the story because Vijay and I did a lot of self-publishing, but I mean, Jesus.
I can't explain. I can't. You know, I was studying architecture, and I loved like the projects in school. But then the idea of graduating and being an architect in a firm was deflating rather than exciting, because then nothing that you had dreamed of could be produced, because it would be like all the constraints of the clients and the sites and so on. But with publishing and with printing, it felt so direct. And to try to explain this to somebody who all of their life has been able to go Apple P, and then boom, it comes out of like full color out of a printer. You can't know, but at the time, the ones that really understood were our Russian friends, because they walked into the loft and said, "You have a printing press right
Russia,
there."
that's an imprisonable offense.
We have to jump ahead because we have a lot to cover.
Okay. We still have the
how did we...
preamble.
Yeah, all right.
But it's at the core of everything else.
It is at the core, and I'm just going to very quickly show a couple of things. These were the streets of Soho. This is a project.
It was a way to earn money, yeah.
It is a way you earn money. Use your printing press. You printed up these maps. Did you design them? Did you? Well, that looks like your artwork.
Mm-hmm.
And so you would take those around to shops.
Right, because what I liked about publishing is also that I didn't have to apply for grants, which was against my religion, to have to beg somebody for money. Like, I wouldn't be able to do a quick starter or any of those things. I like the kind of moment of truth where you bring something to a store, you leave it there, you put a price sticker on it. If people want it, they buy it. If they don't want it, you take it back the next week.
Okay, what's really crucial here, though, is that you are, this is self-publishing. You are, and you're going around and looking for outlets for people who will sell it. You're creating your
But the real
own
business
little...
core of this was, it looked like a map with little listings of all the stores and galleries, each of which had to be paid for by the store and gallery and had to be talked into doing this, and then they would sell the map, so it became a self-distributing thing. Yeah. But it meant that for Françoise to be involved in publishing meant not just learning how to operate the printing press and work on the graphic design and the production of this thing, but to become a salesperson, which was not her personality at all. And she had a very... a husband with a screw loose, basically. Like, what do we call the publishing company for this thing? I said, we could call it Crass Publications, because it was about selling ads, you know? And so she didn't know what crass meant. It was fun. Bonjour, I represent Crass Publications.
Well, how did you guys come up with the name Raw for your publishing company?
Well, he wanted something I couldn't pronounce.
No, I wanted something with 3 letters when we started talking about this.
Is this because of Mad Magazine, your love of Mad?
Yeah. So,
Well, but I
We didn't want to be
incorporated
slick.
a business called Raw Books and Graphics back in 1978, like 2 years before even thinking about doing the magazine. When I got the press,
And what were you
in
doing
order
then?
to-
You weren't doing the books.
I was
you were
doing little mail books, anything that I could print on a small format because I didn't have a large.
If you go to the slide
sheet.
above the one you got, it's probably some of that stuff that she.
That's fun.
I was doing a Zippscope with Bill. So this was like a stories that Bill Griffiths designed to be done in this format. So it was a long, wordless narrative, and then I made up, I think 100 of those, where I stitched them together the way I'd learned from my dad's plastic surgeon how to roll bandages. So I rolled the strip along a
Actually, it was
spool.
originally done as like microscopic sized panels for a 2-page spread of comics, but real tiny and silent. And it seemed like this would be the natural thing to do, even though it meant rolling strips of paper all taped together. They would stretch across an entire, how long is our loft? 200? Yeah, 100 feet or so of space, and then rolling these things up, mounting them on little camera film spindles, putting them in a slide box where we had to cut out by hand the little square screen. It was insane. It was insane.
Okay, so I really tried to get Art to bring one of the old ones out of the drawer, but he wouldn't do it.
Demos it.
They're a little delicate. Okay, so you're living in Soho, or maybe not in Soho.
Yeah, no, it
yeah.
was Soho, but, and it was because it was cheap again, and it was not legal at the time. But that's why a lot of young people.
Did you say
went
it
there.
wasn't legal at the time?
It wasn't legal to live there. No, those were factory spaces, and they were not. They didn't have certificate of occupancy. So at night you had to put curtains over the windows, otherwise. And we didn't have like sanitation, so spent half our days trying to find places to put our garbage. Because otherwise.
Wow. All right, so you're living illegally in some building in New York City. You have a giant printing press on a dolly that you move around the house. You're printing these maps during the day to make money and kind of learn the city and making contacts. And at night, or also you're using it to make art
one
projects.
slide above that, I think
Yeah.
that's the one or two. There's like a bunch of little things that Françoise made.
What time? How much time do we have? Because I feel like, how could I only have like 10 minutes left? Is that right?
What?
Is that right? That's not right? Somebody tell me what was going on here.
Let's just do it, and then they'll
all right, you know
get
what?
the hook and drop
you know
that
what?
machine
Yeah,
behind us.
get us off of the stage. Come on.
Good luck.
So,
There's a bunch of little mail books and things that she made. Yeah.
is that it? Yeah, that's it.
Well, that's
no,
stickers.
those are
and stuff.
stickers to
Yeah.
advertise Raw.
Yeah.
But above or below that, there's a bunch of little booklets and stuff in one slide.
Yeah.
This was to make it easy and smooth.
Yeah. Oh, here we go. I found it.
No, that's
No.
close
That's.
up for some
I'm
pictures.
not.
That's it.
Hey.
That was the first stuff
So,
Françoise published.
I mean, again, I wanted a format where I could do everything. So those that look like there were card shops at the time. That was a possible way to distribute things. So I made mail books, which were 8-page booklets that I stapled and then put a little like.
You didn't want to just
sticker
run
on it.
down to Kinko's or anything, huh?
But it was a Kinko's didn't exist, but they were like print shops. But if I could do it myself, like there's a moment where a friend of ours was running a bookstore on Spring Street called Spring Street Books, Jim Drugas, and I called him up, and he's the one who had suggested I do a map of Soho, and I called him up and said, like, Jim, is there some things that you would like to have for your store? I said, well, I have a business card, maybe a bookmark. I said, okay, a bookmark, great. And then I had those instant plates where I also had a camera where I could do things. But I had art draw a doodle on a bookmark. And then I remember calling Jim, like, Jim, I got your bookmark, And Jim is like, it's 2:30 in the morning. It's like, it can wait till tomorrow. But it was so exciting, So again, in the day of, truly everybody having a color printer in their house, I don't know that you can. the marriage of industrially produced multiple copies of some things that you can actually yourself bind and staple and bring to store.
At this time, we were beginning to meet artists from different countries and whatever who were involved in fairly sophisticated graphic design, illustration, and comics. Were among the first things that she printed is these little 8-page booklets. So it was, in a way, the genuine seeds of Raw magazine.
Well, I actually see something down in the bottom right there. Actually says Raw on it, and it looks like an early version of the logo.
Yeah, that was actually a party at the Danceteria once we launched Raw. So in Raw, the impulse came for me to try to put something that would be putting all of this disparate stuff together. The old stuff, like there's something by Caran d'Ache, there's a book by Mark Byers, there's one by Arts, there's one by Charles Burns, there's one by Pascal Doury, French artist, a rubber stamp catalog. I wanted to have everything in one place, and Art was like, no magazine. I don't want to do
After
a magazine.
Arcade.
So
Like, never
basically
again.
that's you're starting to think, what if we just did all that in one magazine?
Yes, and there was something.
Oh, we're getting there. We're getting
Getting to the
there.
starting gate.
There was something to the range of things. Partly was because of everything that Art has shown me. There were common denominators between Topfer and between the stuff when he came to France, and then we went together to Amsterdam and to Spain and to Italy. There were things that were together, even though the styles were completely different. And there
Now,
were
would you
people
see
in the
their
US.
art printed somewhere, or would other people introduce you to
We saw it printed. Things were a little bit ahead of where America was at that point, and there were comic shops that had the equivalent of zines or small press things. And as we're rummaging around it, it was like, I didn't know that I was looking for a new gang of artists that we would publish at once in one place at the time. But there were common denominators in the sense that nobody was like anybody else. That was the common denominator. So we'd find artists who were unique. And they were working with words and pictures, they were working in panels, they weren't like each other. So in Raw, we were just looking for people who were making something new in comics. And at that moment, at the first issue of Raw, we were very inhibited about using any of the underground comics friends I had, because we didn't want it to seem like an underground comic.
You know, the way you just described it to me seemed a little bit like Mad Magazine, where you had everything was a different artist with a completely different style.
Well, like the EC cartoonists were encouraged to be themselves as illustrators, not as writers. The Best of Mad was done by Harvey Kurtzman. He wrote everything and micromanaged every panel. I wasn't quite after that, but we did want to put collisions of very different styles and very different mentalities together. The common denominator there was almost everybody except one artist was incredibly depressed. So the first issue was called "The Graphics Magazine of Postponed Suicides," from a quote by E.M. Surayan, who said, "Every book is a postponed suicide."
But there what we were looking for was not a house style. At some point, we realized that we were doing the opposite of what a magazine normally does. A magazine chooses one logo, look at the New Yorker, and repeats it for every single week for 90 years. In Raw, we change the logo every single issue. We change the subtitle every single issue. We change the styles of all the various artists. So this is Jerry Moriarty, that was Charles Burns, that was Mark Beyer. And what we found when we were talking to all those different artists is that they admired and respected each other's work when they were discovering it. And that was a common denominator, that everybody had, as Art was saying, a unique voice.
What became interesting retroactively is seeing that each of the artists that we found that we were using more than once, or sometimes even just once, in Raw, couldn't find congenial places to publish, in a sense, even in Europe, because they weren't like other things, and yet each of them also at the same time recognized each other and also created inadvertently schools of a kind, like Joost Swart, who had invented this clean line style that was taking Tintin and revving it up. Oh, you have that page by him. There. Right. Yeah. So he's doing something called the clear line.
That's what, yeah.
And he had revived this kind of style. It was almost as off the charts as Crumb reviving the Thimble Theater, L.Z. Seeger, Basil Wolverton, dirty, ratty style in a world of Peanuts, UPA less is more cartooning. And so each of these artists seem to develop like people going, oh yeah, one can do it that way, and then there'd be a whole lineup behind them of people doing that. Gary Panter's another one. You know, it was an artist that at the time was kind of electrifying in that first punk moment. And I don't know if you followed any of this, but there sure were about 50 artists all looking like different versions of Gary Panter, because he changed his approach every 3 months and developed a different school of imitators.
Yeah, this magazine, there's only, how many issues were there?
Well, when we started, we were saying that we're going to publish either twice a year or once every 2 years.
This was, again, the advantage of my language skills over hers in English. Because she said, we should do a magazine. I said, no, I did Arcade. I don't want to ever do that again. You get everybody mad at you because either you don't give them enough pages or you're exploiting them. So I said, well, if we're going to do a magazine, and I'll then have to combine Mouse, which I had started with Raw, and I don't know when I can make a deadline. So let's do it as a biannual. And that was good because it's really confusing. A biannual either comes out twice a year or once every 2 years. And I figured this was a deadline I could meet. So we did 8 large-size issues of Raw, and I think we then changed formats so we could have longer stories to a small Paris Review-size type magazine, and or Granta, and that was like 3 issues of that.
But the first year, 1980, managed to put out 2 issues, one in July and one in December. After that, it was 1 issue of Raw and 1 issue of a one-shot. Things like Jimbo or the books by
But that
Gary
artist,
Panter.
Mariscal, was the only person who wasn't depressed. He hadn't heard the bad news. When I saw him in Angoulême a few years ago, he was totally bummed out. But like back in 1980s, he was doing great and very exuberant. And it was just someplace inspired by somewhere between Saul Steinberg and Robert Crumb and maybe Ubay Works. He came up with this crazy way of making things and became a very important designer with Memphis. This is that guy, Pascal Dury. That was an issue of, and he unfortunately died young, and he was the only one who really seemed to collect art books. Like he had a totally pristine one-room apartment that had about 1,000 hardcover, beautifully printed books of very contemporary art that nobody amongst the rest of us would look at or could understand. But he was doing this particular thing was originally done for some very tiny French zine, and it had all these penises in it. And we were trying to get newsstand, and we had newsstand distribution, so I didn't know whether we should just try to get away with it and put it out. But then I realized, no, it's better to take advantage of all the liabilities. So we blanked out all the penises, and then in the front of the magazine we said, like, if you send us a self-addressed stamped envelope and a proof of age, we'll send you the penises. So we printed up stickers with all the penises and like where to put them in the story. That was fun. I remember getting this one thing, like this woman sent this very beautiful, her driver's license, and she was stunning and says, I must have the penises. And then, oh, that's important. Yeah, like if you go from the last page of the Pascal Dury thing where there's no interest in trying to cover up the penises because you couldn't even find anything in that picture. So
I've been looking for the penises. I've been looking for the penises in here for a while.
So we let that be as it is. That's the explosion at the end of that strip.
Oh God, I found the penises.
Found the
There's
penis?
like, oh my God, there's like screws and knives and oh.
But then the page, when you flip over, the page after, and that makes an important
So this
point.
is a double page spread. You can see the spine of the book
Right.
in the middle there.
And then when you
that's
flip-
the end of that story, and you'll flip the page.
And you get a Yost Swart thing, about as clean a thing as we could find with this beautiful, restful, blank white area. 2 artists from opposite ends of the aesthetic spectrum, in a way. And I think that was if you want to talk about editing raw, that was editing raw. That was like trying to let people be fully themselves and create collisions by or continuations. The way things were placed were as important as what the things were.
There was an argument that we wanted to make with magazines, which is not that comics could be this, or that we had, like a lot of the other French magazines, like Métal Hurlant was science fiction, where like specifically advocating like either humor or science fiction or genre, but we wanted to say like comics can be anything, you know, it's very open-ended and it can be all those different styles, and it was best made by putting together long story with short stories, graphics. I mean, we called Raw magazine of graphics because they were single images. We had illustrated text pieces. We did,
and we were bringing after the first issue, we began bringing like the a part of the underground comics along into this new large format magazine. At the same time, they were bringing in European artists who were doing something novel within their own cultures, as well as at some point my really talented students from the School of Visual Arts, and bringing their work into the magazine with everything else, as well as bringing painters who had a cartoony brain somehow into the magazine. I should say,
I can tell you the effect it had on me. I went into a store in 1986. This is jumping ahead a little bit in our story.
you better, otherwise I'll be here till 4 in the morning.
I know. And I found this magazine, and it had the effect in every way of what you're saying. It exploded my sensibilities about comics. I was not that interested in comic books. I hadn't been since I was 12 maybe, but I was really into comic strips. And at that time, Doonesbury was like my favorite comic strip, but I loved Pogo and Peanuts, and was a Dick Tracy fan. And I went into this comic book store, didn't even know they existed, and I found this Raw. And I was I'm just holding it. I can't even believe the colors and the size, and I had no idea it was, you know, basically small print runs, that it was so self-published, and I didn't really even know, you know, some of these are European. Unless their name was very clearly, you know, European or something. And it does exactly everything you said. Let's get to the mouse in the room, shall we? Now this is starting with issue 2 of Raw. And we're going to come back a little bit to the aesthetics of Raw in a moment. Starting with issue 2 of Raw, each issue contained a serialized chapter of Art's work Mouse, this comic story Mouse. And what's interesting is that, again, you turn the page and you're not seeing what you're supposed to see. Instead, all of a sudden, there's this little tiny book in here. There's a lot I've read recently about the designs were based on pamphlets, and I guess I'll start by asking about the size. Okay.
Yeah, this is one of those things where I didn't intend to be doing a magazine. I thought we were going to do a one-shot to show what people should be doing in a better world. And then I didn't know that Françoise intended to put this out all the time. She wouldn't tell me that, or I wouldn't have started.
She said it was biannual.
Eventually, we got to at least agree on that. But we wanted Raw to stand out on the newsstands, and Arcade sort of got lost by it wasn't even an underground comic. It was a magazine-sized thing. It was black and white comics. It didn't quite fit next to Mad or Creepy or Eerie, but that was the only possible place to put such a thing on a newsstand. So basically, it was still sold as an underground comic magazine-sized thing. And learning from our mistakes, I was going, the format has to be something that will kind of attract people who don't usually look for comics. And it was at the moment when Andy Warhol's interview was out, a magazine called Fetish, the magazine of gourmet bathing, whatever that was. Wet was gourmet bathing, and Fetish was gourmet spending or something. And that was about fashion. And then there was one called Skyline, an avant-garde postmodern architecture
and they were
all like that size or
newsstand,
tabloids.
hanging up.
So we were just another one of these so-called new wave magazines, and ours just happened to have things that looked like comics in it. So that was helpful. But when I found out that we were going to do Raw more regularly, and that's when I decided it would be a biannual so I could make the deadlines, I had to combine these two tracks. I was already working on Mouse as a book. When I moved back to New York, I turned 30. I was supposed to be dead in a motorcycle accident. I'd never even learned to ride a motorcycle. I knew I couldn't trust myself because I was now going to be over 30. And so on. So I just moved back to New York, and I had to eventually talk to my father because he was in the New York area. And for a while, I was doing the Dick Tracy Crime Stopper of putting a towel over the phone so it would sound long distance. And I say, "Hi, Dad. Yeah, life in San Francisco is just fine." But I knew that couldn't last forever. So I decided to pursue this project that involved interviewing him, and I had to do it small size. So to answer the question about size, I knew that Maus had to be drawn in a 1-to-1 ratio. Like, in other words, I didn't want to reduce the artwork down. I wanted the mark I made to be the mark you saw, so it would have no room for decorative bullshit.
Most comics are drawn twice as big
Yep.
as they are reproduced. And that's very standard practice. I guess it's so it hides your mistakes or something.
Yeah, it
Or
basically
maybe it's just
minimizes
easier
your
to draw.
mistakes. And I wanted to like keep my mistakes 1-to-1 so that there'd be that intimacy. And I had to like keep it relatively stripped down in order to make the drawings fit in that 1.5-inch square, because the book you have is the size that I drew these things. The problem was, after about 8 years out of the 13, I'd learned to draw small, and if the book had gotten any longer, I would have had to draw it small and blow it up to keep it looking the same. But nevertheless, it had to, this large-size magazine where everybody had these vista-like spaces, and we wanted you to be able to take the measure quite literally of comics by doing this Life magazine-sized thing. I was working in this tiny booklets inside that format.
Everything else in Raw was self-contained, was 1-page or 8-page or even 30-page stories, but Maus was the only thing that recurred from issue to issue.
I'm going to go through a few pages here of Raw, because the aesthetics that it established kind of really reverberated everywhere. There's so many cartoonists that got their start in Raw, or at least as far as I know. And let's just take a look at some of these pages here. What do we got here?
Jack Tardy's book about World War I.
Now, that's not the first place it was printed, was it?
No, but the strip Manhattan, it was the first place it was printed, the one you had up before. One called Manhattan was in the first issue of Raw.
Yeah.
But this is, okay, there it is.
Yes.
And he also was somebody who began a school of a sort, of serious comics for adults that were not like the other things around it.
Yeah. All right, let's look at this.
Jose Munoz. See, originally it was a Potemkin village, like it was the underground comics thing that led to arcade. That was a natural because everybody lived in the same Bay Area, pretty much, almost every contributor, some in LA, one in Chicago. But we were like finding people from all over the world and pretending we were a community, and they met only by having first seen each other's work in Raw. And eventually it became a real community. So that photo is Charles Burns and who else is in that picture? Jose Munoz and me. I think that was the first time Munoz and Burns met each other. So we were creating a community by creating the magazine that was the Clubhouse.
And when we're looking at all these different colors and styles, what did that mean on the printing press?
Well, color we had very little because it was only the covers. And stylistically, again, we were, whether they be European or whether they be American, we wanted people to do their own work and to find their own. The big issue had to do with the length of the stories that could be displayed. And we didn't have too many artists whose work appeared in every issue, but Mark Bayer, Charles Burns, Gary Panther, Suko, Jerry Moriarty appeared repeatedly. Munoz and Sampaio did stories that were like 24 and 30 pages long, so we did it once.
There's one thing you and I talked about just the other day. You're saying all of a sudden you wanted to make this festival be about cartoonists, not about Daredevil, but about, if you're going to deal with Daredevil at all, you might want to do it about Frank Miller or Mazzucchelli or something like that. So what we did from the very beginning was we wanted a graphic design element that would unify the magazine. So this particular one you have up is from the smaller sized issue, but in each of those we had this graphic design element going across to unify it as Raw magazine. And we also had at the beginning of each story the artist's name, not the fact that he was doing a strip called Alex Sinner or whatever he was doing, but that the artist was the way you'd read one short story by Updike in one issue of The New Yorker and then 10 issues later, another story, and you wouldn't be told, these are the rabbit stories that we're publishing. They happen to be by John Updike.
And we tended to favor artists who do their own story. Like, it wasn't the Marvel or DC studio approach where there would be a writer and then a penciler,
Matodi.
linker.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so then now we're going to switch to...
But there were a couple of people who were really constant collaborators, and they made it work, like Munoz and Sampaio being a detective story writer. And what we wanted to do there was, okay, that's great. They're doing stuff, when they work together, they're better when they work alone or with other partners. Well, how much time do we have? 2 minutes? 5 minutes. So I'm not even going to finish that sentence. Take your best shot, man.
Well, we got to talk about this guy.
Oh, what was that?
Interesting young whippersnapper.
This is one of the first appearances nationally, right?
Oh, absolutely. What happened was Chris Ware had been working in a college newspaper in Texas, and some guy called me up and interviewed me for the Texas college paper and sent me the clipping afterwards. And I said, well, your article sucked, but there's a half of a comic strip on the back. Could you send me some more examples of that? And he did. And then I asked for his phone number, and I called Chris and said, would you like to, I don't know if you know what we're doing, we're this magazine called Raw. And he went, you're from Raw? By then, this was already like 1986 or 7 when we were doing the small-sized Raws. And he had kind of learned by staring at Raw over and over again. And he said, I always wanted to be in Raw someday, but I'm too young. I said, no, you're one of the best people who's, I haven't seen anything this good in a long time. And so that was the beginnings of Chris appearing and being noticed.
All right, this is... I don't know how we got... I think I started late. I don't feel like
It's that printing press that we had to get downstairs, I think.
Well, I tell you what, we've got to... I can't not show some of this. I don't want to...
Why don't you just flick through and see what I don't even know what we'd chosen, but just...
Well, this is like some of your research for Mouse, which is fascinating and horrifying. I spent an evening looking through MetaMouse, on a whole night, actually, and I was shaking by the morning. Terrifying images of... Mouse... Mouse made a huge impact on me and many, many other people, of course. One of the things that amazed me about it is that even though it was a cat and a mouse, the obvious, the Jews are mice, the cats are, the Nazis are cats, it was, at the time, the most honest, real, and horrible portrayal of the Holocaust I'd ever seen. I learned so much more about the Holocaust than any book I had seen on it or movie. It was so well portrayed, and I think that was shocking at the time. But
I think one of the things that changed the world of comics that we're in, what changed it on its axis was the good fortune for me to have moved back to New York and having to speak to my father again. Because I had 2 possible projects. One was something called A Life in Ink, which was going to be a fictional cartoonist that lived from the beginning of the century till the then present of 80. And I was going to do it with Françoise's press, and we were going to make little booklets that looked like this is a little gathering of this guy's comic strips, this is his journal, this is the posters he did, whatever. Or I could do this book called Mouse, and I picked the harder one, in a way. But the good fortune there is, even if I'd done as bang up a job as anybody could expect in the universe of The Life in Ink, it wasn't intentional, but by using my own connection to horror through my parents of the Holocaust, a subject that one didn't even dare write poetry about, no poetry after Auschwitz, said Theodor Adorno. I was just dealing with the intimacies of what I grew up with, and I think the thing that changed comics specifically is nobody's noticed like my great panel breakdowns until I would point them out or something. But what they really were noticing was he did something about the undoable and unsayable, and it's not as stupid as we thought, even though it sounded stupid. A comic book about the Holocaust using cats and mice. Could you please just go back to the booby hatch you came out of and leave us alone? No publisher wanted it. I had all those rejection letters.
Well, I think that bear with me, because the metaphor of mice and cats is an obvious one. It's very cartoony. I don't think it was a sugarcoating of the horror. Because the horror of the Holocaust is so well portrayed in Mouse. The way it affected people, the way its slow creep, how truly torturous it was. But by having them be mice and cats, it allows me as a human being to actually read it because it's so bad. Do you know what I mean? I've heard you say that comics work almost as like a burst of word and picture that kind of slips between the two hemispheres before your id has a chance to do anything about it, or goes right into your id, I should say. Mm-hmm. And, anyway.
Well, I think that what happened with those masked faces was, it was a metaphor, but it was a metaphor meant to self-destruct, because it's stupid. It was Hitler's metaphor, my collaborator.
Nice.
And by keeping those masks on, there were two things or three things that happened. One was, it allowed me to deal with it, because I didn't know what every Pole looked like and what every one of my parents' friends and relatives looked like. So by making all the faces almost identical, it eliminated that degree of verisimilitude as part of what I needed to get at, even though I researched every location as best I could, for example. And if I had drawn it more realistically, even as cats and mice, it would have lost that degree of abstraction necessary. So for other people, it allowed them the distance, because that blank face kept you from looking at something. And for me, it allowed me to inhabit it fully, because those were people with people's emotions. And I think that was part of what made it powerful, because when I look at a lot of comics now, one of the problems that I have is a lot of cartoonists don't know how to draw anything except their own body and face. So they'll have a cast of 50 characters, but either the size of the boobs or the length of the mustache or the minor differences are how you're supposed to recognize a character. And I had to work extra hard, because all the faces really did look pretty much alike, to make sure you knew where you were in the narrative. And the narrative had a text-driven component, which was my father's deposition that I put together from all the tape-recorded conversations. So on the one hand, you had this kind of voice, this narrative track holding it, and you had visuals that you could inhabit because you could look past the mask at a face you'd recognize.
Oh, yeah. All right, stop it.
This is the hook. This is the get the hook moment.
I'm going to get pissed. All right. So now we actually are having a moment of success. And I am going to move forward here, because if we don't... Yeah, get those damn lights off. We're almost there. It's all these people.
Oh, yeah, the New Yorker.
Oh, yeah, the New Yorker. The New Yorker, okay, Art has done some of the most memorable and sometimes controversial covers of the New Yorker. Françoise is the art director and has been choosing, I guess why don't you say how that? Would you say you choose it?
I've been the art editor for more than 22 years, yes, and I'm in charge of the covers every single week, so it's been over 1,000 covers.
1,000 covers, so for 20 years?
22 years.
22 years, all the covers of the New Yorker have been, I'm just going to rip through these, and if you see one you want to say something about, please do.
That one was done before Columbine.
Wow.
But there were already gun deaths like the one this past week. This was a back-to-school cover called Guns of September. This was a family issue, so I created the family I could identify with, 3 generations of outsiders.
Hey, that's good.
That was called Brief Encounters. Using like an old-fashioned New Yorker look to bring you back into the Tina Brown New Yorker.
And then this is a very famous cover, of course. And I am going to skip right down to the end here. Oh, didn't get to talk about...
You can't do it, man. We have 3 minutes left.
We got 3 minutes. I can't do it.
They're going to
All
get
right.
the hook.
All right.
Oh, okay. So this was our flag. I mean, this was done basically relating to Raw magazine. Comics as a medium of self-expression. Oh, John, you're such a fool. Which is basically what this festival has been about, what Raw was about. about showing you what leaks beyond the edges of the sterile and becomes raw again.
But the other thing I want to mention is tune books, because Jeff has done one of the most marvelous.
Yes, Raw Publications continues today.
Yeah, because now the future belongs to making sure that our kids read comics.
Yes, Françoise and Art have started a magazine, a comic book line for emerging young readers that are comics, and they really are comics for what different age groups.
Well, for
different
kids
ones.
learning to read.
Yeah,
So,
and it's actually been pretty successful, and it's
we're
won awards.
doing
and,
our best to try to get all of the educational world to accept the medium as a good
It's
medium
kind of a
for
nice
kids.
full circle, because we started by talking about Françoise wanting to learn English and how to read it, and now she's trying to return the favor to people
that's
trying to
very
learn
cool.
English and read it who happen to be
All
2
right.
feet high.
I'm going to jump ahead. We're not going to do questions because we have a little surprise for Art and Françoise. And if there's any members of the CXC board or the council, I would want to come up to the stage here now. If you're here, I see some people coming up. There's a few.
Am I going to get pied? Are they gonna...
What are you guys doing?
All right, and while they're making their way up, I will say I am very grateful for the group of people that have come together to form this. We have
I don't know what they're doing.
all the great. we have all art institutions in town have joined in, and I'm overwhelmed by the generosity and the bravery and the vision of all these groups and of all the people you see on stage here. Okay, well, I stalled.
Just like our event.
Art and Françoise, this is an award that we've created for the show. It's one of 3 that we gave out this year. This award will not be given out every year. This is an award for transformative works. And our basic criteria for it is that it must, it could be done by a cartoonist or a team, but it must, you have to have exhibited, this piece of work must have actually changed the trajectory of comics, transformed it in some way. And I think that we're saying raw, but I believe that we're using raw to embody all your entire career so far, okay? Because, well, I think I'll just shut up for a second, and I'm just going to give this to you.
Oh, this is like the one Bill got. I think I got the other breast implant, Bill. We'll have to share one breast implant between the 2 of us. Thanks, man.
Thank you. And award to all of you.
Congratulations.